The first time I saw you, you were standing at the edge of the rooftop with your back to the world, and I didn't know whether you were about to fly or fall. The first time I saw you, you were standing at the edge of the rooftop with your back to the world, and I didn't know whether you were about to fly or fall. There was something about the way your shoulders curled inward, like you were holding the weight of a storm behind your ribs, something silent but loud enough that I could hear it anyway. You didn't turn when I stepped onto the gravel, didn't flinch when the rooftop door slammed behind me, and didn't speak when I walked closer. Just the sound of wind moving through your hair and the city humming below like it didn't know how close it was to losing someone. I remember the way your fingers gripped the railing, not tight, not like someone trying to hold on, but like someone trying to remember what holding on used to feel like. I remember thinking, I didn't know you, but somehow I did. I remember how the air between us didn't feel empty. It felt like a breath waiting to be shared. I didn't ask you if you were okay because something told me you were tired of answering that question, tired of pretending you knew what okay was supposed to feel like. Instead, I said the only thing I could think of, which was nothing at all. I sat down 3 feet behind you and stared out at the skyline like it could explain you to me. We stayed there like that for hours, or maybe minutes, or maybe time didn't happen at all that day. When you finally spoke, it wasn't a confession. It wasn't a cry for help. It was just your name. A soft offering. A quiet surrender. I told you mine in return, and somehow that was enough to build the first brick of whatever we became. I didn't know then that your silence would one day become the safest place I knew. I didn't know your pain would be the mirror I kept trying to break until I realized it was showing me my own reflection. I didn't know that friendship, real friendship, doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand entrances. It shows up like a bruise you didn't know you had until someone touches it gently and asks if it hurts. You didn't ask for saving, and I didn't come to rescue anyone. But we still saved each other in the small ways that never made the headlines. In the phone calls that weren't returned but never stopped coming. In the texts that said still here and meant more than entire novels, in the way we sat in silence and let it speak for us when our words failed. I remember the first time you laughed with me, really laughed, like the sound had to crawl its way up through years of buried grief just to make it to your throat. It was a shaky, broken thing, but it was real. And I remember thinking I wanted to protect that laugh. I wanted to make the world quieter so you could hear yourself better. I wanted to be the kind of friend who never asks you to be strong when you're tired of being strong. The kind of friend who doesn't fix you, but sits with you in the ruins until the pieces don't feel sharp anymore. We didn't talk about our pasts, not at first. But it leaked through in the way we flinched at certain words, in the way we both stared too long at exit signs, in the way we clung to moments like they were the last good thing we'd ever touch. And slowly, without planning it, we made a language. Out of glances and gestures, a dictionary of survival. You'd bring me coffee without asking how I took it. I'd bring you silence without asking what was wrong. You'd send me songs at 2 a.m. and I'd listen to them like prayers. I'd draw chalk outlines of stars on the pavement, and you'd stand next to them like you belonged in the sky too. There were days we didn't speak. Weeks where life pulled us under and we didn't reach for each other. Not because we didn't care, but because we trusted the tether. We knew it would stretch, but it wouldn't break. And on the days it felt like it might, we stitched it back together with jokes that weren't really jokes and hugs that lasted a second too long. I remember the time you cried on my kitchen floor, knees pulled to your chest, mascara bleeding down your cheeks like it wanted to leave too. You kept saying, "I'm sorry," like sadness was a crime. I didn't say, "It's okay," T-shay. I just sat next to you and cried too, 'cause sometimes the only way to say you're not alone is to bleed beside someone. We built a home inside each other, not a pretty one. Not the kind with clean lines and painted walls, but a shelter. One made from broken things. Old memories, half-spoken truths. Forgotten birthdays, midnight walks, silent apologies, shaky forgiveness. But it held. Somehow, it held. Even when we didn't. Even when I pulled away because I was scared of needing someone that much. Even when you disappeared for 3 weeks and came back without explanation. Even when we both said things we didn't mean because the truth felt too heavy. We always found our way back to the rooftop. Not physically, but emotionally. That edge. That place where it all began. That space where nothing was said, but everything was understood. I think that's what friendship is. It's not just the laughter or the good days, but the way someone becomes your landmark. Your place to return to. Your echo. Your mirror. Your safe noise in a world too loud. And now, even after all this time, even after life has shifted and grown sharp around the edges, I still feel you in the quiet. In the way I pause before answering questions that feel too heavy. In the way I sit with people who don't need to talk. In the way I look for rooftops and wonder if someone else is standing at the edge waiting for someone to see them. You were that for me. The one who saw me without needing to ask why I was broken. The one who called the cracks beautiful instead of flaws. The one who showed me that shelters don't have to be made of stone. They can be made of moments, of breath, of the quiet weight of someone who stays. There was a night when the rain didn't stop, not for hours. Not even after the city gave up pretending to stay dry, and I found myself outside your door with no umbrella. No explanation, just the kind of silence that knocks louder than words ever could. And when you opened the door, you didn't ask me why I was there. You didn't scold me for being soaked or say anything at all. You just stepped aside like you'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. And I walked in without a word, leaving puddles behind me. Leaving pieces of myself like breadcrumbs I hoped you'd follow. And you did, not with questions. Not with analysis. Just with that look that felt like forgiveness before I even knew what I needed forgiveness for. And I sat on your floor while you handed me a towel. Not a dry one, but a warm one. One that smelled like detergent and kindness. And something else I couldn't name, but desperately wanted to hold on to. And you turned on the kettle without asking if I wanted tea, because somehow you always knew when my silence was saying yes. And the window fogged up from the steam in our breath, and neither of us moved to clear it, like we were finally ready. To not see the world clearly for once, ready to live in the blur. In the moment between thunder and peace, in the heartbeat just before we remembered how much it hurt to feel. And I told you something I hadn't told anyone. Something I didn't even mean to say. It just slipped out like a thread unraveling. Like my chest had finally given up on keeping secrets. And you didn't flinch. You didn't offer advice or wrap it in pretty words. You just nodded, like you'd been carrying a version of that same story inside you for years. And we sat like that, not needing to fix anything, just needing to know it didn't make us unlovable. And I watched your face soften in the dim light of the kitchen. The way your eyes carried the weight of too many midnights, and I thought about all the times I had almost texted you and didn't. All the times I wrote your name in the Notes app and erased it. All the times I chose silence over vulnerability and how, even then, you never made me feel forgotten. Just delayed. Just paused in a moment that would eventually come back to life when I was ready. And somehow you always were. Ready, not in a performative way, but in the way a tree is ready to hold the snow without breaking. And I asked you why you kept showing up when I didn't deserve it, and you just laughed. Soft and broken and warm, like I'd asked why the moon still rose when no one looked up. And you said, because friendship isn't about deserving, it's about deciding. And those words stayed with me, crawled under my skin, made a home. In the quietest parts of me. And I think that was the night I stopped expecting people to leave just because I was messy. And I think you knew that too, because you never asked me to be clean, never asked me to heal on your timeline. Just kept showing up like a lighthouse that didn't care how lost the ships were, only that they had somewhere to aim for. And we fell asleep on opposite ends of the couch that night, your cat curling between us like a peace treaty, and I woke up with your hoodie draped over me and your hand resting near mine. Not touching, just close enough that it could have been accidental or intentional, and somehow that meant more than any apology ever could. And that morning you made pancakes and didn't speak until I did, and when I did, it wasn't to say thank you, it was to ask if we could go for a walk. And we did, in the wet streets, stepping around puddles and sharing a single earbud. And the song you played was soft, haunting, the kind that lives in you for days. And I realized then that every memory I had with you felt like that, like a song that didn't demand attention but never stopped playing. And when we got to the bridge and leaned over the railing like we used to on the rooftop, I looked at you and wondered how I ever survived without this, without you. Without the kind of safety that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. And I asked you what you were thinking, and you said, "Sometimes I wonder if we're just two ghosts who decided to haunt each other back to life." And I laughed even, though it hurt, and I nodded, because that was exactly what we were. Two people carrying too much, breaking too quietly, loving too fiercely, in a world that made softness feel dangerous. And even though life kept pulling at us, kept trying to stretch the seams of what we had, there was always this thread, this invisible thread that looped through your soul and mine, and we tugged on it when we got scared, when the silence got too loud, when the world started to feel like a place we couldn't survive alone. And I think that's what kept us whole, not the fixing, not the healing, not even the love, but the choosing over and over again to stay. It was during the fall that things started to unravel, not in the loud way that makes people panic, but in the soft, creeping way that mimics normalcy so well you don't notice the cracks until they're already deep enough to swallow you whole. And you and I were meeting less, texting shorter, laughing slower. Not because we were angry, but because life was beginning to speak over us, louder and louder until it felt like our quiet language couldn't compete. And I could feel you slipping, not away from me exactly, but inward, curling into yourself like a page being folded at the corner, like something important was being marked but not said. And I kept telling myself not to pry, that people come with seasons, that friendship isn't a leash. It's a door you leave open, but every day you didn't walk through, it felt like winter, arriving a little too early, and I knew I should have asked, should have reached out louder, should have sent one more message, or knocked on your door, or shown up with your favorite drink and no expectations. But instead, I let the silence grow teeth, and when you finally texted just for words, "I'm not okay today," dropped everything, didn't even lock the door behind me, didn't even think about what I'd say when I got there, I just ran. Like something in me understood this was one of those moments that friendship is built for. Not the pretty ones, not the ones with matching bracelets and old photos and songs we called ours, but the ugly ones, the desperate ones, the ones where you don't ask for help but hope someone comes anyway. And when I reached your place and found you sitting on the floor by the window, knees drawn to your chest, eyes swollen and red, holding a photograph like it was the last thing keeping you tethered to this world, I didn't ask what happened. Didn't ask who hurt you or why you didn't call sooner. I just sat down and pulled you into me and let your shaking body say everything your mouth couldn't, and I held you there for what felt like hours. Maybe longer, maybe time paused out of respect for the moment, and slowly, with each breath, you began to talk, not all at once, not in a rush, but in fragments. Like someone placing broken glass on a table, unsure whether it would ever resemble anything whole again. And I listened, not with answers, not with fixes, but with stillness. And you told me about the pain that didn't leave, about the weight that settled on your chest every morning, about the days that felt like walls and the nights that felt like drowning. And I didn't say you'll be okay because I knew that wasn't the truth you needed. I just said I'm here over and over like a prayer, like a promise, like a rope tossed into the dark, and eventually you fell asleep on my shoulder, tears still drying on your skin, and I sat there long. After, afraid to move, afraid to let go of the first peaceful breath I'd seen you take in weeks, and I thought about how no one talks about this part of friendship, the part where love is quiet and heavy, where being present means being brave enough to witness the mess without trying to sweep it away. And when you woke up, you looked at me like you didn't know how to say thank you, and I looked at you like you didn't have to, and we didn't talk much that day. Just moved around your apartment like ghosts in familiar rooms, making tea and playing songs that didn't demand lyrics. And every so often, I'd catch you looking at me like I was a lighthouse you didn't expect to find. And every so often, I'd look at you and think, please don't disappear again. But I never said it because I knew you weren't choosing to vanish. You were just trying to survive in a body that made surviving feel impossible some days. And I realized then that loving someone means staying even when you can't reach them, means building a shelter that doesn't collapse just because they're not inside it every night. And I promised myself I would keep the door open, even if it meant sitting in the doorway alone for a while. Because that's what you did for me once. That's what we've always done for each other, and even when the world was loud, and the colors too bright, and the noise in your head too cruel, I wanted you to know you had somewhere to land, somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't ask you to explain. And maybe that's all a friendship ever really needs, to be not perfect, not constant, not even easy, just chosen, just enduring, just quietly there. There was a stretch of days when the world felt too heavy to name, when even the sun looked tired, dragging its light across the sky like a burden. And everything in me wanted to retreat, to vanish into the soft corners of solitude I had spent years learning how to survive in. But somehow, even in that fog, I felt you, not as noise, not as demand, but as presence, like gravity, like breath, like something that simply existed beside me, without needing a spotlight to prove it was there. And I remember the way we started meeting at the park again, on that same crooked bench near the willow tree that bent toward the lake like it too was tired of holding itself upright. And we never said it out loud, but we both knew we were returning to something sacred, something that didn't ask for joy, but allowed for it, something that didn't chase healing, but made space for the bruises. And we brought thermoses filled with warmth, mine always too sweet, yours always just enough, and we'd sit in the cold like it didn't matter, letting our hands wrap around something hot and quiet while the wind told stories we didn't interrupt. And some days you'd talk about small things, what you read, who called, what dream you had the night before. Some days you didn't speak at all, but I never asked you to, because the silence between us had grown a name by then, had turned into a shared language that said, I see you, without needing to speak. And one day you pulled something out of your pocket, a folded scrap of paper, edges worn soft from being held too often, and you handed it to me without looking. And when I opened it, it was a list. Messy handwriting, uneven bullet points, no title, just a quiet catalog of things that had made you want to stay sunlight on your floor in the morning. The sound of my laugh when I forget to care who's listening, the way your dog greets you like you've been gone forever, the song that always makes you cry but you listen to anyway, Tuesday evenings that don't ask much of you, my name in your phone when it lights up for no reason, and I held that list like it was something sacred, like it was the proof I didn't know I needed, that our friendship wasn't just real, it was essential. And I looked at you and said, you wrote this to stay alive, and you nodded, and I whispered, thank you for letting me be part of that. And something in you softened, something in me cracked, And the silence that followed felt holy. Like a cathedral made entirely of breath and honesty, and the kind of love that doesn't demand recognition, only presence. And that night, I went home and wrote my own list. Not to give you, not to share, just to remind myself that love doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a name on a bench, a text at 1 a.m. that says you up, when what it really means is please don't leave me alone with this feeling. And a reply that simply says, I'm here. And I think that's what we've always done, shown up in the smallest ways, over and over, until the pattern of our presence turned into something we could lean on. And I remember the first time you said, I don't know what I'd do without you. Not dramatically, not in tears, just softly. Like you were finally letting yourself believe it. And I didn't say anything back because I didn't have to, because my being there was already the answer. And later, when I walked home under the streetlights, I realized we had become something most people search their whole lives for. Not perfect, not untouchable, but real. Something stitched together with the threads of ordinary days and extraordinary survival. Something that didn't need to be explained to be felt. And even now, with the years pressing forward like waves that don't wait for us to catch our breath, I know there is a part of me that only exists because you stayed, because you didn't ask me to change, because you saw the ruin and called it shelter, because you walked through my wreckage without flinching, and still chose to sit with me in the quiet aftermath. There was a moment I almost lost you, not to death, not to distance, but to something far quieter, far more terrifying, the slow fade of someone who stops believing they're worth being held on to. And I didn't see it coming, not because you hid it well, but because I had grown too used to your resilience, too used to your laughter returning like clockwork, too used to the way you brushed off your own unraveling with a joke or a smile that didn't quite reach your eyes. And I should have noticed. The way your texts grew shorter, the way your eyes glazed when I spoke, the way you started saying, I'm just tired, even when you hadn't done anything to make you tired. And I remember the night everything cracked open, the night you didn't come to our usual spot, the night I sat alone on that bench for hours, checking my phone like it owed me an explanation, like it could stop the gnawing fear crawling up my spine. And when I finally called you, the silence on the other end was louder than anything you could have said. And I knew you were on the edge again. Not physically maybe, but emotionally, spiritually. Quietly drifting toward the part of yourself that believed disappearing would make everything easier for everyone. And I dropped everything, didn't even grab my coat, just ran, heart in my throat, hands shaking, praying you'd open the door. And when you did, you looked like a painting someone had forgotten to finish. Hollow eyes, trembling hands, lips pressed tight around a scream you didn't want to release. And I didn't ask you what was wrong, because I didn't want to make you name the darkness. I just stepped inside, shut the door behind me, and said, you don't have to do this alone. And that's when you broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just all at once, like a dam whose cracks had been growing for months, finally giving up. And you collapsed into me and cried like you had permission to fall apart, and I held you through it, held you until your breathing steadied, until your grip on my hoodie loosened, until the room felt safe again. And when you finally spoke, you said, I didn't want to burden you, and I said, you never were a burden, just someone carrying too much alone. And I meant it, every word. Because that's what we forget sometimes, that the people who seem the strongest are often the ones who've never been allowed to be fragile. And I told you that if all you could ever give me was your brokenness, I'd still show up. Because friendship isn't about waiting for someone to be whole. It's about standing in their ruins and saying, I still see something worth loving here. And we sat like that until the world softened, until the light changed, until your eyes found mine with something like belief. And in that moment, I didn't care about time or pain or how long it would take for you to feel okay again. I just cared that you were still here, still choosing to breathe, still letting me stand beside you even when you couldn't stand yourself. And later, as we sat on your floor eating cold cereal in silence, I realized that love doesn't always look like grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it looks like cereal at 3 a.m. and breathing in sync and sitting in the dark. Because turning on the light feels like too much, and I told you a story I'd never told anyone. About a time I almost gave up too, and your eyes widened. Not in surprise, but in recognition. And I think that's when the tether between us tightened again, when we both realized that the cracks we carried weren't shameful. They were invitations. Maps to where the light had gotten in, and I looked at you and said, "We're not broken people. Just people who were never taught that being fragile didn't mean we couldn't still be beautiful." And you nodded, and we both cried a little more, not because we were sad, but because healing always feels like grieving something too. And in that fragile, quiet night, we didn't save each other. We didn't need to. We just stayed. And sometimes that's the most sacred thing anyone can do, stay. It happened slowly, like most endings do. Not with a scream, but with a series of missed calls, rescheduled plans. Unread messages that sat there like unopened wounds. And I told myself not to overthink it, not to panic, not to let the old fear creep in, the fear that everyone leaves eventually, especially when they've seen the worst of you. But deep down, I could feel it. The quiet distance blooming between us like a bruise I didn't want to admit was growing. And when we finally met again, weeks after the last time we'd really looked each other in the eyes, I knew something had shifted, not because you were cruel or cold, but because your smile was no longer something you gave freely. It was something you wore like armor. And your words came filtered through the kind of politeness we never needed before. And I sat across from you in that coffee shop, the one we used to laugh too loudly in, the one where we once cried into paper cups and called it healing. And all I could think was, don't let this be the part where we forget how to find each other. But I didn't say it. I just listened as you talked about work and stress and how you were just tired. Always tired, and I wanted to scream that I tied my tallow. I wanted to scream that I knew that tone, I knew that distance. I had used it too many times to not recognize it now. And when you excused yourself to take a call that didn't exist, I stared at your empty chair like it was a metaphor for everything we were becoming. And I asked myself, what changed? What moment did I miss? What silence did I not fill in time? But maybe that's the thing. Maybe some friendships don't end in one moment. Maybe they wear down like stones in a river. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. Until the edges don't recognize each other anymore. And when you came back, I smiled like I was fine. And you smiled like you believed me. And I hated that we had both learned how to pretend so well. And we finished our drinks and walked out into the evening light like strangers practicing a scene they didn't want to perform. And I watched you walk to your car, hand raised in that half-hearted wave that said, I care, and I'm leaving all at once. And I stood there too long. Long enough for you to disappear, long enough for the streetlights to turn on. And I felt something tighten in my chest, something I hadn't felt since the very beginning. Since that rooftop when I first saw you and didn't know whether you would fly or fall. And I realized that love and friendship, love isn't always enough to keep people close. Sometimes the world swells between them, and even the strongest bridges start to buckle under the weight of everything unsaid. And I tried to text you that night, wrote out 3 different messages and erased them all. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I didn't know if they would still land the way they used to. And in the days that followed, we talked. Less, smiled less, reached out less, until silence became the new language. Until our names on each other's phones felt like memories instead of people. And then one day, you didn't text me on my birthday. And I didn't text you on yours, and that was the loudest silence of all. The one that said we let go, even if we never meant to. And I walked through those days like someone grieving a person who wasn't dead, mourning conversations that would never happen, mourning a version of myself that only existed in your presence. And I kept wondering if it would have hurt less if we had fought, if we had yelled or broken something tangible. But we didn't. We just stopped, like a song that runs out of lyrics. And the worst part was knowing you were still out there, still breathing, still living, just not beside me. And I couldn't decide if I wanted you to miss me or move on, because either one hurt in a different way. And I told myself it was okay, that not every friendship is built to last forever, that some just come to show you who you are and then leave. But I didn't believe it. Not really. Because you were never just a season. You were a shelter, and I still looked for you in every quiet moment. Still heard your laugh in songs I hadn't listened to since. Still checked your page when I couldn't sleep, hoping for a sign, a ripple. Anything to say you remembered, and maybe you did, maybe you still do. Maybe you're out there thinking of me too, wondering what we could have been if we had just held on a little tighter, spoken a little sooner, stayed a little longer. I didn't expect the letter, not after all this time. Not after seasons had passed through me without your name slipping into their winds. Not after I had folded my memories of you into the corners of my life, like old photographs I couldn't bring myself to throw away, and yet there it was, your handwriting on the envelope. Still uneven, still unmistakable. And for a moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stared at it, like touching it would break something fragile inside me. And when I finally opened it, my hands shook, not because I was afraid of what you'd say, but because some part of me still hoped you'd say the thing I didn't know I needed to hear. And your words began softly, like a window opening after a long winter, like a voice clearing itself before it speaks into silence. And you said, we're sorry, not for leaving, not even for the distance, but for not knowing how to stay when staying meant being seen at your most fragile. And you said you had to disappear to understand what it meant to be missed, what it meant to matter to someone, even in your quietest, messiest form. And you said you still remembered everything: the rooftop, the rain, the thermoses, the list in your pocket, the silence we wore like second skin. And you asked if I ever thought about us, not as something broken, but as something real, something that taught us how to carry softness in a world that worships armor. And I cried as I read it, not because it reopened wounds, but because it felt like medicine finally arriving after the fever had broken. And you ended the letter with a question, not a plea, not a demand, just a simple line that read, "If you ever want to start again, I'll be sitting on the bench under the willow tree next Friday." And I held that letter like it was fire and light and everything in between. And for days, I didn't know what I'd do. Didn't know if I was ready to reopen the door I had closed so carefully. But the truth is, I never locked it, never threw away the key, just placed it gently in a drawer and waited for a reason to reach for it again. And that Friday, I went. Not with expectations, not even with hope, just with presence, just with breath, just with the quiet truth that some connections don't die. They just sleep beneath the noise until the world is soft enough to hold them again. And when I saw you there, sitting with your hands wrapped around a familiar thermos, head tilted toward the lake like no time had passed at all, I didn't cry, I didn't speak. I just sat beside you, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and for a moment we said nothing. Like always, like before, like silence was still our native tongue. And then you turned to me and smiled. Not wide, not perfect, but real. And in that moment, I realized we weren't starting over, we were continuing. From the only place we ever truly existed, right here, in the quiet, in the almost, in the ache and the comfort and the choosing. Again and again, and I said, "Hi," and you said, "I missed this." And I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I had missed it too, in the kind of way that doesn't go away even when you convince yourself it has. And we sat there as the light changed and the wind shifted and the world carried on around us. And nothing had to be fixed. And nothing had to be explained, because this right here was the shelter we built. And somehow, impossibly, beautifully, it was still standing.